Welcome to Vanished Vail, the series where we take you to Vail's special places. In 1880, the Southern Pacific Railroad of Arizona reached Tucson. Construction had moved at a blistering pace, coming out of Yuma across mostly flat, accommodating terrain. There was great fanfare when the railroad arrived in Tucson, but the railroad doesn't wait around long, and at least at first, progress was really quick, and soon it was headed straight east out of Tucson. In a few short weeks, the railroad cut a path through the last bit of flat land before Cienega Creek and the imposing crags of Dragoon Summit. That last flat piece of land would go on to become what many of its earliest residents called the little village of Vail. Now, it just so happened that the census was being conducted. Now, when the census taker arrived in the Vail area, they enumerated over 1,000 Chinese railroad workers. This was the largest concentration of Chinese people in the United States, its territories, and possessions. Who were these Chinese men and boys, and what role did they play in building and shaping the old Pueblo and the future state of Arizona? Over the next 3 episodes of Vanished Vail, we're going to explore the contributions of the Chinese railroad workers and their legacy in the greater Tucson area. Let's head over to the Tucson Chinese Cultural Center and meet up with historian Sandy Chan. Come on, let's go. Hey, Sandy, how you doing?
Hi, JJ, I'm
Good
great.
to see you.
Welcome to the Tucson Chinese Cultural Center.
Thank you. Thank you for having us today.
Oh, this is the center's pleasure.
Hey, well, I can't wait to see inside.
Yeah. Okay, I think really the first question we need to answer is why on earth will we have hundreds of Chinese men in the Vail area in 1880 building a railroad? Why would the Chinese come to southern Arizona in the first place? The reason is that China in the 19th century was in really dire straits. First, you had overpopulation. So with overpopulation, you had a labor excess, so it's too many people, not enough jobs. You also had problems within China because all of these extra people had no place to go. All of the internal migration areas within China had already been filled. And finally, you also had fields intensively used to the point where they were eroded, and there was a lot of problems with agriculture based on the overpopulation. Then you had strictly environmental problems. You had too much rain, and then you would have drought, and then you'd have more rain. So the fields that could produce were having trouble keeping a balance because of too much and then too little rain. So you've got a large population. They are already food stressed. So what happens? Plagues run through. So you've got all of these problems internally with China. You also had a breakdown at all levels of Chinese government, from the top down to the small villages. So there was really no way to cope with these problems on any sort of a scale. And what this did was it led to internal chaos throughout the 19th century. The largest internal rebellion in China in the 19th century was the Taiping Rebellion. It took place from 1850 to 1864. Many scholars believe that this is the most important event in the history of 19th century China. It started in southeast China, which is exactly where the Chinese railroad workers came from. It's then spread to 17 provinces in China. So it was a large, widespread rebellion. Most scholars say about 20 million people were killed in this one rebellion. And there's some scholars who believe up to over 30 million were killed in this one rebellion. And there were multiple rebellions throughout the 19th century in China. Now, the 19th century was also the age of empire. And you've got China with all of its resources, and it's weak. China is very weak. And so you get the great powers kind of starting to pick at the edges of China. And this led to a series of wars, the first of which was the First Opium War from 1839 to 1842. China did not want to buy opium. The British wanted China to buy opium. And what happened for the Chinese, by buying the opium from the British, shifted them from a country of being exporters to being a country where they imported more than they exported. And they did not like that economic factor. And so the first of the opium wars, the first one is the one that we're most interested in, because in 1841, the British took Hong Kong. And the British had Hong Kong actually until 1997, I think. And we are still dealing with the effects today of the first Opium War. Much more immediately, what the first Opium War did was provide a release valve for the Chinese. Theoretically, up until then, your normal Chinese person was not allowed to emigrate. You had to get special permission if you were a merchant or if you were a diplomat, but your average Chinese person, no immigration. After they got Hong Kong, they started flowing out. And the Chinese flowed into Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, Latin America, Peru. They had a lot of Chinese doing guano mining in Peru. Chinese flowed into British Honduras, which we now know as Belize, areas in the Caribbean, Mexico, Canada, and the United States. So it's not just the United States that saw this outflow of Chinese. It was all the Pacific Rim countries. And it's hard to really quantify sometimes the cost of the physical cost to people of what was going on during 19th century China, because there were so many problems and so many deaths from so many causes. There was an interesting study done, let me read the title here, The Biological Living Conditions of 19th Century Chinese Males in America. And this was a study done by a group of authors, and what they found was that Chinese men born after 1850 were shorter in stature because of the lack of food and the chaos in China. It was physically reflected in their bodies. The thing that I found most interesting was that it was across all socioeconomic levels. So if you were a rich person, you still suffered. And that's very unusual to see a country where you've got the poor and the rich suffering to the point where it is physically reflected in their bodies. Now we know why the Chinese wanted to leave China. But what made them want to come to the United States, with all of these other areas around the Pacific Rim being attractive to them too? Well, first of all, in 1848 started the Great Gold Rush, the California Gold Rush. This was Gold Mountain. California was Gold Mountain. And the Chinese came over like people from Europe, Latin America, the East Coast of the United States, because they wanted to make money and get rich. Perfectly understandable. By 1858, the first Chinese recorded worked on a railroad. There was about 50 of these guys working on a railroad in California. Really didn't make too much of a splash back then. 1861, the United States goes into the American Civil War. Fairly quickly, the North, the Union side, realized they needed to get a faster, more efficient way to reach the west coast of the United States, to reach California and the territories along the west coast. Up until then, they had to go around Cape Horn, which is the southern tip of South America, or through the disease-infested Central American pathways. So by 1863, Congress had passed the Transcontinental Railroad Bill and signed by Abraham Lincoln, and they were ready to start building the Transcontinental Railroad. The eastern section started in Nebraska. The western section started in California, and they were to move east and west, and they were to meet in Promontory Summit, Utah, which they actually did. So work started out in 1863, which is still the height of the American Civil War. So there really were not a lot of young men available to work on the railroad. Everybody was fighting on the north or the south. So what the railroad builders did was they hired the Irish. Now, Ireland in the 19th century had a lot of the same problems that China did in the 19th century. Like the Chinese in the middle of the 19th century, the Irish were really discriminated against. They were not popular people here in the United States. So the original group of people hired were the Irish. The Irish did not want to work for the pay the railroad offered. which tells you how low the pay was if people in similar positions don't want to work for the pay. They also had a little problem with gold and silver strikes. So this is still the age when you could, hear of a gold strike and run off and maybe make it rich. So you had people dissatisfied with the pay. And then you had rumors going through the camps. Did you hear there was a gold strike, or did you hear there was a silver strike? And people would just leave. So the railroad magnates were like, we can't build a railroad like this. So somebody got the idea to try the Chinese again. And they were like, well, we don't know if it's going to work, but we'll give it a go. So in 1865, toward the end of when the Civil War ends, the first Chinese were imported to work on the railroad. Yeah. By the end of 1865, 4,000 Chinese had come from China to work on the railroad. And very successful. The Chinese did the job for the pay. They were paid $1 a day unless you were a skilled worker. And the money, the $1 a day, did not include their food. Food was deducted from the $1 a day. So the vast majority were working for less than $1 a day, but they could do that. They could, and they did do that. Now, what happened is the Chinese the railroads used Chinese labor contractors who recruited the Chinese in Canton, Guangzhou, China. These men then signed a contract. Then they had to get on ships and take a very long, arduous trip to the United States. Many men did not even make it to the United States. If disease broke out on board a ship, that was not good. Some of these men just couldn't take the mental stress of being on a ship for 6 or more weeks at a time down in the holds. So some of these men committed suicide. And the other thing that was really awful about this is the Chinese wanted to be buried in China. If you died on board a ship, and it didn't make any difference who you were buried at sea. There was no chance your body was going to go back to China. So this was like doubly stressful, but it shows you how determined these men were to come to the United States. And they were recruited by Chinese labor contractors in China. They were put on the ships. Normally it would take about 6 weeks. Could take longer if you were becalmed. Could take, storms would hit in the Pacific, it could take 8 weeks or 10 weeks. This is very stressful. By 1867, the railroads used almost exclusively Chinese labor. And this meant that the Chinese were the largest corporate wage labor force in the United States during the 19th century. So on the Transcontinental Railroad, they estimate 12 to 13,000 Chinese worked through the length of the whole railroad. On the Southern Pacific, they estimated that 5,000 to 6,000 worked on the whole length of the railroad. Many of the men that worked on the Southern Pacific had also worked on the first Transcontinental Railroad. So we had an experienced crew that came through southern Arizona. We have to talk about the death rates. They didn't really track the deaths because they didn't really care. I mean, if you were working and you went down, somebody came behind you. You went down, somebody would come back. It was a constant filling of the position. Death rates on the first Transcontinental Railroad were some estimate as high as 1 in 10, which, given the dangerous circumstances there, I don't doubt. Some people think that the death rate on the Northern Pacific was a little higher because you had the brutal winters that they worked through on the Northern Pacific. I have no idea how many people died on the Southern Pacific. They didn't keep the records. I have no idea. I imagine it would have been a little bit lower because it was a little bit easier built through Arizona and the Southwest than it was through the North or the first Transcontinental Railroad. So on May 10th, 1869, the Golden Spike was driven in Promontory Summit, Utah. And at the ceremony in Utah, E.B. Crocker, who was one of the big four, one of the 4 important railroad magnates at the time, complimented the Chinese workers by saying, quote, "This railroad we have built has been in great measure due to that poor, despised class of workers called the Chinese." Good words, but their actions never followed up. They never treated the Chinese any better on the other railroads, including the Southern Arizona railroads, than they did through the Transcontinental Railroad. Complimentary, but it didn't really do much of anything. Okay, so what was going on in Arizona?